hey ya ha, hey ya ha, hey ya ha, hey ya hey ya hey ya ha, hey ya hey ya ha, hey ya hey ya ha, hey ya hey ya hey ya hey ya hey ya hey ya hey ya.
Well, I think it's the mission for my life, and I think it came from my mom and dad. My dad had this incredible compassion for his people, for the justice of our people. He used to say, "My girl, our people suffer a lot." And I didn't understand what that was for a long time.
Our fishing rights have been taken away, our hunting rights, we're forced onto a little piece of land. We could be land barons, but we're not even that. We're poor people in our own country.
I have found out that it is not just us First Nations that hurts. It's all of the people around us that are friends and supporters in Hummingbird and my own government and our own nation.
Our main focus, of course, at Hummingbird is the relationships, to build relationships with Indigenous people. So we're inviting Presbyterians to do something different.
Because Mary had this sense that if you just sit people down and say, okay, now be reconciled, sometimes that much focus just on that isn't necessarily the best way to get people listening to each other and working together. But if you find something that's common ground between them, then in the course of doing an activity, they may find understanding and friendship and just acquaintances, and things get done. So Mary had the idea a number of years ago to create peace by doing various cultural and artistic activities.
We thought, what better way? Because every culture has its arts, and there are so many different arts, and they're so important to each one's culture. And Canadians, for the most part, have lost their cultures, their individual cultures.
I think in recent years, some of our liveliest programs have been what we've called Peace Through the Arts. And these are programs that target an artistic activity of some kind, music or dance or drumming. Sometimes non-First Nations people, non-Aboriginal peoples in Canada don't really understand the history of harm that has been done to Canada's First Nations people by governments, by churches, and just by kind of unthinking and sometimes unintentional assumptions that people make.
Racism is alive and well in the Lower Mainland and in the schools. Most First Nations children do not acknowledge their background. We are reaching out to the children and the youth in Surrey. We work out of a housing complex there. We are reaching them with music and dance. That's how we get them interested in coming to our gatherings, they come and have a meal with us, and they sit around in a circle with us, and we ask them to talk about themselves, to share their lives, but we also share our faith with them.
The children are so eager to learn, and it's nice to see some of the children that have talent, really, and to be able to encourage them at a young age to realize that they have that talent.
We had a program where we were teaching First Nations dance, Aboriginal dance, to Aboriginal children. And it kind of had a double focus. It was a way for the First Nations kids to reclaim some of their cultural heritage, especially in urban areas where children they may just go to a school in their area, and they may not, in their sort of day-to-day activities, have a lot of focus on their own cultural history. And so they may not know their dances, they may not know songs, they may not know their stories. And so this was a way of teaching dance by First Nations dancers and artists to First Nations children.
We promote community. We bring people together in those circles, in those gatherings. We try, we deliberately try, and I think this is what people can gain from And we hope that we can inspire churches and others to promote community, not just to come together on Sunday.
I think for non-First Nations peoples, as well as for peoples in churches all across Canada, there is a really important reason to be aware of and interested in and supportive not only of Hummingbird Ministries, but of other First Nations ministries. And for me, if you will, theologically, it comes from my understanding of who Jesus was and how Jesus asks us to be engaged with the world.
So there's a lot of misconceptions about Native spirituality within the churches. And I know when I first started going to a prayer group within my own church, a lot of people were asking me about the Native spirituality.
It's a world of diversity, of many nations, many religions, and at some level getting to know how all that works is important.
A constant attention needs to be paid for who is my neighbor and how do I talk with my neighbor, how do I listen to my neighbor, how do I create peace with my neighbor, how do I act like the Good Samaritan with my neighbor. And my neighbor may not be somebody that I would naturally know just in my day-to-day circle of acquaintances, but that person is still my neighbor. And in Canada, we have neighbors who are First Nations peoples. And I think particularly for Christians to know and understand, to get to know, to be aware of and create a sense of neighborliness with First Nations people is part of the call of the gospel.
Hummingbird has been working with other denominations to have special healing circles to promote the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the national event that's coming to Vancouver in September 2013.
It recognizes that the churches have some work to do and that there is an ongoing relationship between First Nations and the church. And in fact, there are First Nations people within the Presbyterian Church, but that there's healing to be done. And that really, I think, is at least one of the cores of the mission of Hummingbird Ministries.
Hummingbird Ministries is a healing and reconciliation ministries, and it's plural because we work in different areas in the lower mainland of BC. But we're also becoming national. We've been invited to various places in the country, in the Okanagan and Saskatchewan. We've had circles in Alberta. Going to Alberta to do some healing and reconciliation work. Ruth Adams, who's worked with me right from the beginning of Hummingbird, she says, Hummingbird is now international because you're international, working for the World Communion of Reformed Churches. So yeah, the main goal is to break down those walls of oppression, those walls that divide us.
Me qua tswane